pass it over to David Worsnick. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our second presentation in our Performance-Driven Academy 2020 Financial Best Practices. So today we're going to, as soon as I can get my cursor to work, there we go. Today in part two, we're going to talk about budgeting and financial modeling. So we're going to focus in on a couple different areas. We're going to talk a bit about best practices in budget development. We're going to do an orientation to program financial modeling. Really talk a little bit about understanding the relationships between cost, revenue, and volume drivers. At the end of the presentation, there'll be a self-assessment that will ask you to take a few minutes, or that would have been provided for you. We'll ask you to take that. We won't have time to do that today because we'll jump to questions. So we have an hour and a half. So if folks weren't on the first one, I'm David Worsnick. I'm the Senior Director of Fiscal Performance Improvement with CCSI. This series, PDA series, being provided in sponsorship with MCTAC CTAC. A little bit about myself. I have a Master's in Rehabilitation Counselor, Master's in Business Administration. Bit over, at this point, I think about 42 years experience in behavioral health. I started as a substance use counselor, was a mental health counselor, mental health clinical supervisor, program manager, got my MBA, went on and was a CFO for 32 years. And over the last 10 years, I've been spending a lot of time doing data analytics, data visualization, trying to really take a look at how we measure our performance and use that to support decision making. So, what have we learned? I'm not telling you anything new, but operating environments can change dramatically and rapidly. I mean, who thought that overnight we'd have to pivot to a telehealth and telephonic service delivery platform? And so, from that learning, from that experience, I think a couple things come to my mind. One is that a strong financial foundation is essential for long-term financial stability. My guess is, and the expectation is, these kind of disruptive events may become more frequent. So having a firm foundation to operate from to weather these changes in our environment is important. Accurate, timely, and well-organized financial data it's necessary to navigate these changes and to make sound decisions. Because these decisions, they significantly impact your staff, they impact the individuals you serve, the community that you work in. And we really need to have well-organized financial data. And what we all understand is, building an airplane while it's in the air doesn't work. So fixing gaps in your financial operation during crisis is not the preferable way to go about doing it. And financial operations and clinical operations are intertwined, so managing in operational silos is no longer an option. You're going to hear me talk about this every time we meet because I think it is a fundamental change that we all need to incorporate into our organizations. This is that integrated team approach to financial management. And the trends that we're seeing that require financial leadership and clinical leadership to work together is things like value-based payments, where we'll have revenue at risk based upon outcomes. It was easy. I was a CFO. You take a look at productivity and you know what your payer mix is, and your risk was that you weren't providing enough services, you had too many staff, or you had waiting lists, so your risks were something that we had experience with. Now, once you start going into performance-based, outcome-based contracting, suddenly clinical outcomes put revenue at risk. How can you manage in that environment if you don't partner with your clinical leadership when you think about the decisions you need to make, the data that you need to pull down, the budgets that you need to make, the evaluation of your financial data. Increase of telemedicine. Nobody really knows what it's going to look like 6 months from now. We do know it's going to change the landscape. But you need to talk with your clinical staff. How does this look in engagement? What do you think? What type of client do you think will continue to do telehealth? What do you think the percentage is going to be? Do you think that doing telehealth, are we seeing a reduction in no-shows? And are we increase productivity? We're going to increase our service hours. All those kind of questions as it relates. You have to integrate that. That has to be a conversation between finance and clinical operations, because those decisions are going to impact upon finance. And there's all this talk going around about reductions in state support, and it's really required renewed attention at creating and supporting an environment that assures your direct care staff can provide service efficiently and effectively. That's been the new way that I've been talking about our direct care staff. We need to provide an environment where they're efficient and effective, because efficiency and effectiveness are both going to impact financial sustainability. So before we go, we're going to do a quick polling question. And Jocelyn, if you could throw the polling question up for me. From your point of view, does your organization have a strong budgeting process with input from both clinical and financial leadership? We'll take easy question to answer. We'll give you a couple, 15, 20 seconds to, the no's were in front, the yeses are taking the lead here. All right, Jocelyn, you could take that down. It's about 50, it was 50-50, now 48. 52% say yes, but 48% of you say no. So what we're going to talk about today is budgeting, best practice budgeting models, but again, throughout the conversation, I'm going to be stressing that integration that is absolutely necessary to create good budgets. So what is budgeting? I always start with the definition. I like to be speaking from a common language. So budgeting is fundamentally, it's a planning process. It's a document that provides an overview of how your organization is going to allocate your resources over the next 12 months. But it's really designed to allocate your resources in service of your organization's mission. I think that's the key aspect is when we think about budgeting. We are mission-driven organizations. Resources, we need to allocate our resources that we really use our resources efficiently in support of our mission. And so once adopted, the budget becomes a critical financial management tool, and it's really essential to monitoring ongoing financial activities throughout the year. We're going to be talking a lot more about that in upcoming presentations, probably in our fourth presentation when we talk more about reporting and data analytics, data tools, those kind of things. But, some folks, they create the budget and they put it on the shelf, and they don't go back to it. But it is a management tool. You put a lot of time and energy in, and it really needs to support your operations. So in the way that we do that, with each reporting cycle, you compare actual performance against your plan. And we'll talk more about that. But it's a planning document, and it is a document. So the importance of budgeting. First thing, it helps you focus on short and long-term strategic goals. I always see budget is it's a strategic document. You think about, all right, this is what we're doing now. This is what we want to be doing next year. Is it always the same? Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes we have new programs. Sometimes we want to grow programs. Sometimes there's a client population that we haven't been serving that we want to begin serving. So it's really, it is a process for us to think about and think strategically about what we're going to be doing in the next 12 months. It assures that we have revenue available to deliver your mission, and it allows us to set spending limits, keeps costs in line with revenue, and it's a plan to use current resources to their maximum. we always worried about overspending and not having enough revenue. There are situations where we have sufficient revenue, and we need to make sure that we're maximizing the use of that revenue. So the other piece is that it provides your board with a critical document necessary for important role of financial oversight. I've been sitting on community boards for probably the last 15 years. I've been treasurer, I've been board. Budgets to me were always a critical aspect of helping me carry out my financial or fiduciary responsibility as a board member. I wanted to know that the organization was really utilizing their resources efficiently, that they were meeting their target populations, that was really supporting the mission. So it is a key aspect for your board. And it keeps funders and donors informed. I mean, how many times, you apply for a grant, you have to have a budget. You get grants and you have to send them monthly reports, quarterly reports, yearly reports. Everybody wants to understand how their resources are being used. And now what we're overlaying in performance. How many people are you seeing? How are the changes that you're seeing? What's your engagement rates? It's becoming much more of an involvement of thinking not only about the dollars, but the outcomes of those dollars, how well we're performing, what we're doing. So, there's this, so we have some really important factors here for this budget, both internally as a planning and strategic planning document, part of the governance responsibilities within your organization, and a tool for transparency with your funders, whether they be the state or your payers or private grants that you may be receiving. So, let's talk a little bit about how I think about the process and how I used to go with the process that I used to go through. The first thing is start early and have a process. So, start working on your budget at least a few months prior to the start of the fiscal year. If your fiscal year starts on January 1st and you're just beginning to start talking about your budget on December 15th, it means you're not going to have a good budget. You're going to pull your old budget out. You're going to say, okay, this looks good, this looks good. You're not going to have the time to really make it a strategic management tool. So, give yourself sufficient time. You've got to gather information. You have to talk with your clinical staff. The board has to be involved in part of the strategy going forward. And you really should have the board approve your budget prior to the beginning of the fiscal year. So give yourself time. I went through periods in my career where budgets were just something that I did. I did it because I had to do it. I changed that a number of years ago when I began thinking about how important this was, how it informed our thinking, how it shaped our movement forward. And in this environment that we're in, where things are getting harder, we need to be more nimble. We need to pivot many times, but we need a structure to work from, and we have to be thinking out into the future. Sometimes I talk with people about in certain areas they having at least an 18-month budget or a 24-month budget to be thinking more, particularly if they want to make significant changes in their organization. So give yourself time. Make sure you clearly define roles in the decision-making process. So who are you going to bring to the table? Who's going to make the decisions? How does that work? Who's on the budget team? Executive leadership, finance, HR, operations, clinical operations. Who makes the final call? How do those decisions, and what is everybody's role? What is finance's role as part of the budget? What is clinical operations' role as part of the budgeting process? How do they work together? And so really make sure that there's a clarity about this. What you don't want to do is getting in fights. You don't want the finance director going to the CEO about something and then have a clinical director going in because you don't agree on something. You know, there has to be an arbiter in this. Somebody has to have clear roles and responsibilities. Everybody needs to know what is expected of them in this process. And it should be part of your culture. It should be transparent. You know, in your process, as I said, should provide from input from those staff will be responsible for meeting budget expectations. I can't tell you the number of clinic managers, clinical leadership that I talk to, and they're at my finance kind of technical assistance seminars because they get handed a budget and that's it. And they say, and they're being told, here, you have to manage to this budget. They have no input. They have no ownership. They don't really understand maybe the underpinnings of their a program, and it's just not fair. I mean, it's just not fair. You can't expect people responsible for meeting your financial goals not to have a voice in setting those goals. Now, that's not to say that that's an easy conversation, and that's not to say that they're going to win a lot of those conversations. There are financial realities, but the partnership allows you to understand, clinical can understand financial constraints, finance can understand clinical constraints. You can work together in a partnership to come up with a better budget. So, what do we need? Start early. Give yourself plenty of time. This is not a chore that you should dread. It allows us to think strategically. It allows us to plan. It allows us to bring voices to the table. It allows us to see where we're going and to set our goals and to enhance our mission. So, start early, then what? So, understand your current financial condition. So, how do you build a budget? So, the first thing I would do, say, let's start in October. So, I'd run my September year-to-date. I usually get those around 10th of October. We normally got our numbers pretty quickly. I'd compare those to the budget, and then I'd make year-end forecast. Because what I wanted to do is I wanted to use this year's expected expenditures and revenues as a template for next year. So I do those year-end forecasts. I mean, that wasn't, I didn't spend a huge amount of time and energy on that, but I did take where we were today, prorated it out to the end of the year, overlaid anything that I knew that was unusual that was going to happen in the next couple months, expenses that I knew we were going to incur. But, when you're on an accrual-based accounting, that's a little bit easier. If you're on cash, that sometimes takes a lot of work. And then I carry out a root cause. I do a root cause analysis every single month of my current budget to actual variances. So I had been following these variances all along. But I do that once again. And I said, okay, I created a budget last year. We put a lot of time and energy. It was a strategic plan in many ways. But we didn't meet our goals. Why? What is going on? And use that to inform your thinking as you move forward. Oh, we missed the mark because we were overly optimistic in the number of clients we were going to be able to serve in that program. And so we've been watching the intakes over the last 12 months. And now we can do a better projection. Because last year was a new program. This year I've had 12 months over my belt. I've got a trajectory that I can work against. So I know that I can do a better job predicting what next year is going to be. And so make sure that you understand what you got right last year and what you got wrong last year. Have that inform your thinking and have good data to base your projections on. And identify your opportunities, threats, and emerging trends that are likely to influence your activities. If you've ever gone through a SWOT analysis, a part of that is opportunities and threats. I talk about this as a strategic document. Opportunities and threats are part of your strategic thinking. What are the threats to our environment? Threat to our environment could be a reduction in state aid. An opportunity in our environment would be an expansion of our telehealth to certain client populations that engage better. And we may have opportunities to reduce our no-show rate. Or you may have opportunities, an organization in our region is closing down, the clients are going to need. We may have ability to increase our clients. So you can't just think internally. You have to take a look at your external environment and be thinking about what your opportunities are and what the threats are, and incorporate those into the budget. And then evaluate financial trends of your programs over the last few years. Look for growth opportunities and address downward program trends. I used to always have an 18-month trend line of key performance indicators for each of my programs. Could be units of service, could be clients served. It really depended on, if we had per member per month contracts, that could have been a little bit different from normal contracting. So what we wanted to do is, excuse me, I was getting a Windows message over on one of my screens. I just wanted to make sure it wasn't going to interrupt our process here. So you want to understand what your trends are in your program, and that requires good data. Like I said, I always did 18 months worth of data. I've always thought that was really a good way of understanding my trends, and use those trends to build out your next year's budget. Upward trends gives you opportunities. Downward trends may need you to rethink for the next budget year how you're going to be working with some of your programs. What is the problem? Is this downward trend in admissions something we can't control? Is it a change in our environment? You have to ask yourself all those questions. So again, you need all kinds of time to do that. Particularly if you have a lot of programs, you have to talk with a lot of people and really incorporate that into your thinking. I said don't operate on assumptions. That slide is probably mislabeled because we make a lot of assumptions. I guess maybe I should have said don't operate on guesses. Assumptions can be made on data. We are managing in a period of uncertainty, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. So we have to make assumptions. We have to look at our data, we have to look at our trends, and we have to make some assumptions of what's going to happen next year. This time around, it's much more difficult. So if you're on a calendar year budgeting cycle, you're starting to think about your next year's budget. How do you make some of your assumptions? It's very difficult. But don't operate under guesses. Have data. If you don't know, you can't say what percentage of our services are going to be telehealth next year. Well, if you're tracking your telehealth services through the end of the year and you're starting to do some on-premise work again, you can get a little better feel based upon data than if you didn't have any data to look at and you just made a wild guess. So increases and decreases in both expenses or revenues that you know or anticipate will occur in the next budget cycle, and incorporate them into your budget. So I always used to take my year-to-date data and I take a look at it and I say, okay, what is going to be different next year? And sometimes a lot of times that is going to affect your expenses. It's going to affect your revenue. It may affect your staffing. So what do you expect to be different? So you're in a conversation with clinical leadership, and clinical leadership says, oh, we're going to implement this best practice next year in all of our clinics, and we're going to require training materials, and we've got to get certified in best practice, and it's going to cost X. Well, obviously, you need to know that to build that into the budget. Could be, oh, we've got this application, IT comes to you and says, oh, we've got this application software that we're going to sunset in the first quarter of next year. we're not going to have our licensing fees for 3 quarters. We need to redo. So that's the kind of conversation that goes on. What's going to go up? What's going to go down? How can you incorporate that? Be clear about significant changes that you're building into the budget and have good data to support it. You know, if you're building out, you know, base that on pretty good data. This is, you know, we're not guessing that, you know, the number of intakes that we've been seeing over the last 3 months are going to increase. You know, we've taken a look at this over time. We know what we're doing. We have these 2 new referral sources that have been very robust, and you know, base that on the information that you have to support that. And finally, I've seen some folks build stretch goals into their budgets. That's okay. I was never a big fan of that, and I was never a big fan of that for 2 reasons. One is that stretch goals in and of their nature is goals that we really most likely don't expect to achieve. So as you're sitting down every month with your clinical leadership and you're going through the financial performance of their programs, of how well they're doing to budget, they're never going to be successful because we never really thought that they were going to be successful. But I never thought that that was a good way to operate. Now, I mean, that's just a personal opinion, but you think about that. The other reason I didn't do that, I just didn't want to explain to the board every single month why we were not making our budget projections. You know, you can say till you're blue in the face, well, I didn't want to sit in front of the board and say, well, we build a budget that you approve, but we never really thought we were going to reach these expectations. That's not a conversation that I want to have with the board. That, you know, my conversations with the board were built on trust. And it was important that they trusted me, my staff, the projections that we made, and constantly saying to them, we didn't meet it because we didn't think we were going to meet it. It's not the conversation that I wanted to have. So be careful about that. You know, temper them with reality. You know, pushing people a little bit, that's not a problem. I don't see that. But, you know, real stretch goals in a budget is something that, you know, I never thought was a good way of going about it. I've been talking about this the whole time, making budgeting a team effort. Involve your staff in creating budgets. So what we used to do, the process that I did, so finance would put together, and, you know, I'd pull down my data from last year. I'd project it out to the end. I'd build a budget shell, basically. And then what we do is we put a team together, executive leadership, clinical leadership, and then we would schedule meetings with each of the program managers and their supervisors. And we'd take their particular budget, and we'd meet with them, and we'd have this conversation. All right, so this is where we are. This is how well we did. This is what we got right last year. This is what we got wrong. This is why we got it right. Here are the trends. This is what we're seeing. What are you seeing? You know, you guys have been talking. What are your plans? What would you like to see next year? Can we sustain this kind of growth? What's happening with the program? We've been working on this program for the last 24 months to get additional referrals. It hasn't worked. Is it really going to work next year? What's going to be different next year? And you have those conversations. And in those conversations, you educate folks about what the budget is, how the revenues get generated, why productivity is important, you know, why it is that we look at certain parameters. And then you ask, you know, and I always say, if you could have anything you want, what would you put in this budget next year? Caveat was that is not, you're not necessarily going to get it. But help me shape my thinking about what your goals are, what your longer-term goals are. I then can keep that then in the back of my head because I know where you want to go, and I know what you think would be helpful for you. So that conversation was always about, you know, what do you want? Then we had the reality conversation. Sometimes it was discouraging for folks. Sometimes it wasn't, and it really depended on the environment, the program, what was happening. It was very complex. But allowing that conversation, I need to inform and educate my clinical leadership. They need to inform and educate me. And we took it down to the supervisor level. Supervisors are on the ground. They're working with the staff. They're closer to the action than your program managers are. They know what they need. They know what their staff needs. And they're an important voice to have. So I always structured a situation where I could get that level of input from the team. And, did I get buy-in all the time? No. I mean, I'm not going to say that it was a perfect process. But I think that presenting it the right way, I was able to engage folks. There was ownership. I gave on some things, understanding that, if we put money here, we can't put money there. And if that's okay, if that's what you want, that's fine. Let's go ahead and do that. But buy-in and understanding the budget. And that, to me, it was a partnership because, I can bang people over the head all day long to reach our financial goal, but there are so many things that are just outside of my control that are not necessarily in the control of the clinical staff, but certainly the purview of the clinical staff. And so a partnership really in terms of planning, strategic thinking, putting the budget together, really I think led to a much better product in the long run. So let's talk a little bit about some nuts and bolts. One of the things that I found that organizations do in their budget process is they take a look at last year's revenue and they say, okay, last year we got $1 million in revenue. I think this year we're going to have a 10% increase, and so I'm going to build a 10% increase in the revenue. That's easy to do with expenses, right? I've got rent. All right, I know my rent's going to go up 2% next year. I build that in. Utilities. Utilities have been flat for the last couple of years, 1% growth. Fringe benefits. Health insurance is going to, all right. But you know that. It's based upon information. It's based, but there's no information that tells you your revenue is going to go up 10% next year because your revenue is tied to service volume. Your service volume is tied to the number of staff. Your service volume is tied to the productivity of your staff. Do you have control? I mean, is that something that's fixed, like a 2% increase in your rent? No, absolutely not. Productivity patterns change, no-show patterns change, staffing change, the number of people you have out on disability changes, the number of people that you may have out on family leave changes, your referral pattern changes. So you just can't go and pluck a revenue number based upon last year. You have to build that based upon activity. So as I said, I'd have an 18-month unit of service graph. And we'd just sit down and we'd take a look at that, and we'd take a look at trends, and we'd try to understand why they're trending that way. We would project that out, and then we would make estimates of what our volume was going to be, the number of units then we'd be able to say, okay, this year we did X number of billable units or billable hours or however you want to think about that. And we think we're going to do a little bit better. This growth pattern is about 5%. We're going to extrapolate that out to the end of the year. Oh, and by the way, if we do that, we're going to need one additional staff, so we'll build that additional staff in. Our payer mix has been relatively stable, but we're going to lose this commercial plan. But it won't really have a huge impact, but it might change our payer mix by 1%, so we may want to. So it's that process again. You can't pluck revenue numbers. Revenue numbers are critical, and so you just have to take the time and effort to understand your volume, understand how that volume generates revenue. and then to take a quantitative approach to determining what your revenue is going to be. And again, take into consideration payer mix and payer mix changes. I always understood my payer mix. I always knew the percentage, at the very least, of Medicaid, commercial, Medicare, private pay. But the other portion of that we often miss is denials. So you go in and you say, oh, we did this many units of service and it's going up and we project it's going to be this next year. And I know my average reimbursement rate per unit of service is $120, so I'm going to take my units, I'm going to multiply it by 120, but we didn't take into consideration that we have a denial rate. And so we're counting all these units that we're producing, but we're forgetting to take into consideration units that we won't get paid for. So payer mix, denial rate, uncollected copays, and deductibles. A number of folks in high deductible plans now. I think that we could do a poll across a lot of providers, and to the provider, they'd say they don't do a good job. It's more difficult to collect copays and deductibles, particularly folks who are on high deductible plans. And so we have this leakage of revenue that we have to take into consideration. And because of those problems, overestimating revenue is a common problem I see. And overestimating revenue means is that you're overestimating your costs or the resources, not your costs, the resources that you have available. And that's an important factor that you have to take into consideration. So what we're going to do is I'm going to jump, and I see that somebody chatted in a question. Continue to chat in your questions during the course. I'm going to make sure that I organize my time here to have some time at the end to answer questions. So please feel free to chat in your questions. So we have a polling question here. So new polling question. And let me move the chat out of the way so I can see the results if you take a second. So once it's completed, use it as a management tool and review actual expenditures and revenues to budget on a regular basis. We'll give you guys another 15 seconds. All right, we're doing good, doing good. All right, Jocelyn, let's shut it down for now. So 32% you say yes. The largest group says yes, actual the budget is reviewed quarterly. Good. No, actual budget is reviewed sporadically, 16%, and then 4% say no. So 20% of you are not using your budget as a management tool. Now, to the 48% who are doing it quarterly, I have an opinion about that. Not surprisingly, I have an opinion about a lot of things. But my opinion, and this was from experience. So one of the reasons that I always did trending is that I always needed, it's a skill of understanding when you need to take action. That is, so I'd be watching a trend and I'd say, okay, let's give it another month. Or, all right, let's give it another 2 months. But if it hasn't changed by the third month, we're going to have to take action. The problem I have with quarterly or periodic review is the sooner you can identify a problem, the easier it is to fix it. So if so they say quarterly, but the reality of the situation is March, it's the end of March. Your financials are not ready till the middle of March. You don't review them to the end of the March, then you're 4 months in. You've lost 4 months of time to be able to address an important issue that is maybe reflected in your financials. Quarterly is a lot better than not at all. Quarterly is a lot better than sporadically, but I was always an extremely strong proponent of monthly. I want to know as soon as I possibly can when I'm running into a problem, because I can fix a problem much easier when it's small than when it's large. The changes I can make when the problem is small are much less dramatic and have much less impact on our staff and the individuals we serve than when it's large. So my only recommendation for you folks that are doing core is just think about that. It's really not that hard. We'll talk a little bit more about actual budget analysis when we do the in the fourth presentation. It's really not that hard to get your data out of your general ledger and into a report format relatively simply, either using your general ledger software, which means you have to input your budget into general ledger software. It takes a little bit of work, obviously. I'm not going to say that that's a simple thing. Or you can have off-system kind of ways of doing that analysis. I always did my actual budget analysis off-system, and the reason that I did that is general ledger, to be able to incorporate your A&OH into your monthly program-specific expenses, you either had to journalize A&OH and then reverse it at the first of the next month, or you just ignored it. And if you just ignored it, what you were looking at is you were looking at a program budget that didn't have 15% of its cost in there. And so we were always then working on a expense analysis that was insufficient, did not have the level of cost in there. So I had a very simple kind of an Excel thing. We did a download from our general ledger. I incorporated that with my budget, did a simple analysis, and I'll show you a little bit. I'm going to show you a little bit of budget model and how I incorporated that. So that's the only comment. And for you, for the 20% of you folks that, you know, if you're not from finance, you need to go to finance and say, you know, we need to start doing this. And if you are from finance, I think that's just a critical responsibility that you have. And, you know, one of the things you have to do is you have to figure out how you can get your books closed in a timely manner, how you can build a structure of getting an analysis, how you can do root cause analysis, how you can work with your clinical lead and executive leadership. I think that it's just one of the primary responsibilities that we have as finance leadership. And I'll get off my soapbox. We'll move on. We've been talking a lot about this, monitor your actual budget throughout the year. You know, so I've said don't create them and put them on a shelf. Take a look. You see I underlined monthly here. Monthly. It should be part of the culture. It should be the way that you do business. Understand why there's a variance. Determine if it's programmatic or if programmatic or operational changes are warranted, and determine when you need to make those. Sometimes we hope things are going to change, and folks they're going to change. We're doing this and this and this, and they're going to change. And say, okay, but have a plan. You know, say, okay, you know, we're going to implement this programmatic change. We're going to start calling people the night before their visit with an expectation, and we're going to change our scheduling practices. So we expect to see a decrease in no-show rates, and we'll have an on-call list. And if we call somebody the night before and they say they can't come in, we'll see if we can slot somebody in. And we think our productivity will go down because our no-show rates will go down. Good, great, perfect. It's one of the recommendations we have for folks. But you know, watch it. So what happened in the first month? What happened in the second month? What happened? Why didn't it work? Why is not our no-show rates going down? What do we need to be thinking about? Have we, you know, was it a concept that's just not working? So, you know, you have to be able to take a look at, you know, what do we need to do differently? I've made a lot of changes in programs over the years after determining that the status quo just wasn't going to work for us. And so that's when you use your budget to understand, and then you make a determination of how long you're going to let it go on, what changes you're going to implement, when were they implemented, how did they make the change, and then move forward with that. Your budget it's an effective management tool. Use it that way, particularly if you put a lot of time and energy into it. So budget challenges in a COVID-19 environment. There's a lot of them. I tell people that I was a CFO for 32 years. I'm happy that I don't have to, that I'm not in, your financial leadership shoes right now. Managing under uncertainty is just difficult. It's challenging, it's stressful, but I have some ideas on how, we may want to address it. Our costs are going to be skewed, but we can quantify that. We can know what that is. Service delivery patterns have certainly been disruptive. It's going to affect this year's financial, but and we don't know when and how quickly things are going to change. So, future state is just hard to predict. But as I said before, I tell people, I recommend to people is you have a graph, and one line in the graph is units of service, and the other three lines is one line's for on-premise, the other line's for telephonic, and the other line's for telehealth. And you watch those changing patterns. You go back to the first of the year, it could have been all on-premise, and you would have seen it drop. But you're going to watch those trend lines. So although we don't know what future state is going to be, by December, we're going to have a little bit better feel for it. Maybe not better, but let's make some of our assumptions and predictions based upon data, based upon the trends that we're seeing. Do we think the trend is going to carry forward? If it is, what is that going to look like? And we certainly have an uncertainty about, when some of the waivers supporting clinical operations, whether they'll continue. If not, how long, that kind. So again, managing an uncertainty, budgeting uncertainty is difficult. But I have a couple of recommendations. So understand and clearly articulate the assumptions you're making. Know what you're building into the budget. All right, we have this trend pattern based upon our health. We think that, by, on average next year that we're going to be 50% on-premise and 50% telehealth or whatever, and we built a budget around that, and those are our assumptions. Watch service delivery trends. Quantify your one-time COVID-related costs. Are you going to duplicate those next year? Do you need to pull them out? And then work with your clinical staff. What is the effect telehealth is going to have? What's the effect on staffing, productivity, revenue generation? How do you envision the new environment? How does your clinical staff envision the new environment? What clients do they think are really going to engage through telehealth? Are you committed to continuing telehealth? What portion of your business? With what clients? How is that going to affect? That has to be built into your thinking, into your process. So what do you do under uncertainty? You stick to best practice process. You do what you've always done. You get as much data as you possibly can. You project that data out. You understand what you did wrong last time. You understand what you did right. You use that learning, and you build out a budget. Educate your board and management staff about the assumptions you're making. Make sure everybody understands. We're going into this budget is uncertain, and it's uncertain because of these, and this is what we put into it. And because you're going to have to explain variances, and chances are you're not going to get it perfect. Some of your assumptions may be good. Some of your trend patterns may hold out. Some may not. But you need to be able to educate everybody that this is a difficult budget year. And factor your assumptions in your monthly actual to budget analysis. So, if you're sitting down with your clinical staff and your executive leadership and your units are off by 10%, well, you need to be able to say, somebody needs to be able to say, well, we had, this is the trend line that we predicted for these units. This is the actual line. Let's see, our assumptions were a little bit off here. This is the effect. But what we were able to do, although our unit assumptions were not where we were able to reduce some of our no-show. We had a little bit higher productivity. So our our revenue generation was a little bit higher than we anticipated. That's the kind of conversation you need to be able to have, or somebody needs to be able to have every single month to add nuances to the data that you're looking at. And you have to be able to quickly pivot if your assumptions are way off. Oh man, we thought that, we were going to be at 90% on premise by March 30th. Now, how you would make that assumption, I don't know, but you could. And it's not even close. So, you need to pivot and say, whoa, this is off base. What's the effect going to be? And how do we change operations related to that? So that's my budget talk. What I want to do is take a few minutes here to show you a model that I use that sort of talks a little bit about what I've been talking about. So this is what I call a budgeting modeling tool that I use with agencies, actually. And I'll just walk through because this is the way I sort of organized myself in the budget. The first thing we did is I always budgeted a line item for staff. Now, I know for large organizations that could be difficult, but I did some consulting with an organization that had 350 staff, and they chose to do line item staff budgets. If you have the resources to do that, it's certainly more accurate. Your staffing costs, along with your fringe benefits, it could be 70 to 80% of your costs. That means you should be spending 70 to 80% of your time, at least, in really thinking through what your staffing is going to be. And I always did it at a line item basis. And you'll see in this kind of model, what a lot of us are doing is that we're moving to shared staffing models. And in those shared staffing models, what you have to really do is make sure that you're getting the allocation of staff correct, because to have an accurate budget, you need accurate breakdown of your staff. So in this model, I've got a peer specialist, and I've got two programs, mental health and case management. I'm going to allocate 50-50 across that. It's pretty simple, but my recommendation on this side is to do a by line item staff. So here's another piece that I do fringe benefits. I always did fringe benefits by type as a percentage of gross salary. So this basically says for every dollar in salary, I'm going to spend 7.04 on FICA, 7.04 cents. And my total fringe benefit cost is going to be $31.19. The reason I do it that way is that it was always hard for me to say, okay, if I had a 2% increase, or if I had a 10% increase in my health care costs, well, how would that affect my total bottom line fringe benefit expense?
David?
And so, yeah.
We can't see the Excel sheet.
You can? Oh, well then, I'm glad you told me, because let's stop sharing. Let's try this again. It doesn't do any good if I'm talking and nobody can see what I'm talking about. How about now?
There we go. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, no, thank you. I apologize, everybody. Zoom sometimes drives me nuts, but so let's go back to staffing input. As I said, I do a line item staffing. So I did this in all the time. I'd have all my programs across the top. This is set up for 10 different programs, including overhead. And this probably should be 1%, like 1 FTE. So I do an allocation, I do line item, and I do make sure that I allocated my shared cost, staffing cost across programs accurately. As I was saying, in the fringe benefits, I do fringe benefits by type. That helps me understand if, health is 12% and it's going to go up to 15%, that's actually an additional 2% on my total fringe benefit cost. And, you always want to watch these, particularly the non-mandated. because when times get rough and times get tough, this is where we start taking a look. Particularly, all right, can we reduce our health care costs? Can we pass on higher deductibles to our staff? What might that look like? But understanding each of these separately, I thought had significant value. Then on the expense input side, I always took two views of this because, again, I had my shared expenses. So I'm going to share $1,200 in telephone across my 3 programs. So I build my allocation models over here. So telephone is going to allocate 10%, 50%, 40%, and that's going to allocate based upon the number of people, number of telephone lines. We don't talk about telephone lines anymore, but some kind of standard kind of allocation methodology. Maintenance or repairs is a little bit different because that's going to be allocated on square feet along with janitorial. So, you're going to allocate your shared costs during the course of the year anyway. So I always built my allocation models in the budget process. And then you'll see what I'd always do is I'd always make note of what my allocation basis is. Auditors like to know that. You like to know that you're being consistent, your allocation models are consistent with CFR expectations. If they're different, you need to be able to explain that. And so I take time to do my allocation models during the budgeting process. And then you have your fixed costs or your program-specific costs. I build those in, again, at a line item basis. And then revenue input. So here's an example of revenue input where I said, okay, I'm going to have 80% of my services are going to be provided by Medicaid, 10% by Medicare. So I had my payer mix. I knew what my average reimbursement rate was for each of these. And then in my activity input, I said, okay, I've got 6 FTEs. I've got expected monthly units of 86 units. We're going to be billable at 90%. So I've got, and it's going to be 12 months, so I've got 5,573 units that I'm going to expect to generate with this payer mix. And that gives me then, I can predict my revenue by type. So again, it is payer mix, activity, revenue by payer mix to predict your cost. So I never even looked at last year's revenue numbers. I always built them out against this kind of model. And then what I did is I had a detailed budget, which I used to, for in-house purposes, has all the line items. Then I had a summary budget. This is what went to the board of directors. I didn't think that the board needed to be in the weeds on actual line item expenses. But when I did go to the board with this, I told them what was different from last year, what we're trying to accomplish, what was up, what was down, how we made the decisions we made, why we made the decisions we made. So I make sure that I informed them of what the budget, what we were trying to accomplish through the budget, and then that helped inform the conversations that I had with them on a monthly basis. So that was the summary budget. Now we're going to be talking more about this in the 4th presentation, but what we do here is I put in a situation where I could just drop my actuals in by summary. It's really pretty easy to get a summary by personal services, fringe, OTPS, and my operating revenue. I knew what my units were. I could take a look at my payer mix, and this was actuals on a monthly basis. So I could dump them into there. See how simple that would be to dump your actual numbers into there. I have a budget already created. So what I can do is just to do an analysis, which is So once I dump the data out of my general ledger, it takes 5 minutes to input it into here. All I've got to do is tell it what month it was up here. It's going to prorate my budget. It's going to take my actual, and all these formulas are already built. I have conditional formatting built in here. I know what's good. I know what's bad. I can do my root cause analysis. Sometimes the root cause analysis is not obvious. So I have, in this case, I'm good on my expenses. My revenue is down. I have a loss, which is, I have a loss which is sort of greater than I anticipated. But my units are down. It could be the fact that your units were up, but your payer mix changed and your average reimbursement rate was different. So you need to really carry out that level of analysis. And then you could build other simple productivity pieces in here. This is an example of a staff productivity model that you could put in. So I always try to get as much information inside of a single spreadsheet that I can. So, Jocelyn, I'm back to the PowerPoint. Can you see the PowerPoint again in non-display mode?
No, I still see your Excel sheet.
Okay, so why it is forcing me to stop sharing and then reshare is beyond me, but we'll just go. Do you see it now?
No, not yet.
Just you. Oh, it's getting there. Yep.
Okay.
Okay, and then I'm going to jump back. I got one slide and I got to jump back to a spreadsheet. So that doesn't work, but we'll do it. So from the current slide. All right. So I'm going to do an introduction to financial modeling. I've been having a lot of conversation. We've been doing a lot of work on financial modeling. So what do I mean by a financial model? Well, budgets are a form of a financial model because you take a look at expenses, you take a look at revenues. What are your expense drivers? Staffing, fringe benefits, operating costs, A&OH. What is your revenue drivers? Volume, payer mix, average reimbursement rate per unit, different reimbursement rates for different unit types, and what are your volume drivers? Productivity, number of staff, and so you're building that out in your model, in your budget. So your budget's a kind of a financial model. But what we've been doing a lot lately is program financial or program-specific financial models. They're specific to the model, and they're created in a way that allows the user to change expense volume and revenue variables to understand the effect of expenses and revenues. Now, we did that a little bit in the budget. In that budget, I could go in, but it gets clunky. So I'd have to go in and change. So if I wanted to say productivity is going to go up 2%, I may have to go in and change that number in my budget in a couple of different ways. In the financial model, you just change it in one place, and it rolls through. And what's nice about a financial model, you can see how these variables interact with each other. And you can build scenarios, and you can play with it, and you can play with it outside of the budgeting. So, and then, like I said, through scenario building, the user can better understand the variables that drive financial success, and they can create benchmark standards to manage against. So by modeling, a lot of times what we model is we say, okay, we need X amount of volume at this average reimbursement rate to cover these amount of costs. And so what would that productivity rate need to be? And so you model that out and you come to a conclusion about that, and you say, okay, this is what we're going to monitor against. This is our benchmark standard. This is what we need to expect. This is what we're going to look at on a monthly basis. And so let me show you a quick one. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to just go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and then let me bring this model up for you guys. And let me stop sharing. And let me share again. I apologize. This is a little bit clunky, but it's not giving me any other options. Jocelyn, you got a spreadsheet in front of you?
We do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So this is a model. This is a model for substance abuse clinics that I created for the Office of Addiction Services and Supports. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. So we have everything captured in this little space here. Let me do that. Let me do this and collapse this guy. And so what are we working towards? We're working towards net surplus and loss, which is right here. So I build out this model. There's different things that you can put in. So this is so different from my budget, where I built my budget on a line item basis. On the model, I'm going to build it by groups of staff. So I've got 2 peers, or 1.25 peers. So I'm going to put 1.25 peer here. But where these kind of models help you is that you can play around with stuff really quickly. So you could say, all right, I'm right here at a surplus or a slight surplus of $7,000. What if my payer mix was 86% Medicaid and 3% third party? Well, okay, that gives me a little bit more, but not a lot. So 1% of my payer mix didn't make a huge impact. So should I worry about my payer mix, particularly that it's 85% Medicaid? No, probably not. You're probably good with that. So let's take a look at productivity. So I've got my peers, and I built out 3 contacts per month or per day. What if we could really organize ourselves and the peers could do 4 contacts per day? What would that do? Well, you'll see with an additional contact per peer, I went up from what was an 8,000 surplus to a 28,000. He said, yeah, but they're out in the community. They tend to spend more time working with individuals. A 4 is probably not doable. So let's say that 3.5 is more reasonable. You're still at 18. So you decide, well, no, we're going to keep this at 3. But here's my MD and PMP staff, and they're at 6. What if we really got good at scheduling, good at organizing, really work the no-shows, and I could take that up to 8. What's that? Well, I went from a $7,000 surplus to a $68,000 surplus. What would happen if my fringe benefits went up to 30%? Well, okay, that would take it down a little. But you see the value in a financial model is everything's in a single view. In your budget template, you've got multiple programs. You have different templates for your staffing, for your fringe benefits. It's really not that easy to go in and do your scenario building. You have to run back and forth. So basically what we do in a financial model, we create a budgeting template, so to speak, and we build this single view that you have in front of you. And then you just play with stuff. You just play with stuff. And what it does is it allows you to better understand the impact of each of the variables. So one of the things is that I always talk with folks about is, so here I've got a $30,000 loss. And so, okay, how are we going to deal with a $30,000 loss? Well, we'll have all different kind of ideas about how we deal with a $30,000 loss. But I always tell people, one of the things that we fail to understand sometimes in our budget models is how these different variables interact with each other. So what if we said, okay, our supervisors now carry 20% of a caseload. So let's give them 30% of a caseload and ask them to see 2.5 clients a day. Half a client a day, simple. We just took that down from 30 to 13. Does it impact everybody? No. Does it impact your supervisors? Yes, of course it impacts your supervisor. But was it significant? Maybe not. Maybe this is 2.25. All right. So, we asked them to do a little bit, and this is down to 20. All right, we did that. So what if we worked more with our peers? And instead of 3, we want 3.25, just an additional, suddenly we're at 16%. And, what if we thought that, our vehicle expenses, we're going to be doing more telehealth. We thought we were going to be in the field all the time, and this is going to go down to 8,000. Well, okay, then that's so. The value in thinking, and sometimes what I did is I built this model first. I built my scenarios and then transferred that to my larger model. So what does this tell us? It tells us that we need to hold our fringe benefit percentage at 30%. We need to make sure that we do see the savings in our vehicle costs. We need to keep an eye on our payer mix to make sure, because this 86% here is just a critical factor. And we're going to work with our peers. We're going to say, we think that, with a little bit of rethinking about our processes and how we're scheduling, reducing travel time, using telehealth in some circumstances, or making sure that we reduce our no-show, we can do it by, a quarter of an extra contact per day without changing anything else. So what did we impact? We impact 2 staff groups, and that's it. And we're much closer to our goals. So maybe we have to go in and say, okay, our MPs is going to be 5.5, an extra half a person a day. And suddenly we're down here and we're at a $6,000 margin. So I bring this up because we've been getting a lot of calls for financial modeling. I think it's a really helpful way of understanding drivers, being able to understand the sensitivity of each of your different drivers, and then understanding how a couple small changes that affect smaller groups of people that don't affect morale or make significant changes in our operation, how sometimes they can lead to the outcome that we're looking for, and then we manage to these numbers. And that's what we do on a monthly basis. So that's financial model. I see that I, through the magic of being lucky, brought this in right at 3:14, so we have about 15 minutes left for questions. I'm going to stop sharing this. I'm going to go back, so let's stop sharing. And then let's share my screen again. And I'm going to go up here. Again, I apologize for that. I'm going to do it from the current slide. And we did this. Before we get to questions, we do next steps. So everybody should have we'll have a part 2 of financial practice best assessments. Or, best practice self-assessment, sorry. So one of the things is that, I do these things all the time. And one of the things that I think is, and I used to go to these all the time too. And, you'd sit there and you go, oh, yeah, oh, good, we're doing that right. Or, geez, maybe we could do this a little bit differently. Or, boy, we're really falling down on this. And it was interesting, and it would create some kind of conversation, but I would never implement the changes that I need to implement. Didn't have the time, for whatever reason. What we hope through this process is that you'll go through the self-assessment, and after each of these, you'll find one thing. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're doing everything right. And it's not to say that what I'm telling you is the gospel truth. There's all kinds of ways of doing best practice, but I think we've captured in these presentations what are some of the fundamental ways, approaches, ways of thinking, tools that you can use. Take the self-assessment, and if you find you have a gap, use the action plan template, set a goal. Start putting in place the tasks that you're going to. What we really want this experience to be is movement from content to change, and change to improve, to be better. You know, we talked about in the beginning, would not wish this environment on anybody from a financial or clinical operations standpoint. It's really difficult. But that's then incumbent upon us to do it right, to really have our structures in place, to have all our ducks in a row. So if you find that there is, in fact, a gap, then let's see if you can try to address it. Use the action plan template. We're also putting together office hours. There's going to be, and that information is going to go out right after this. There's going to be 2 one-hour sessions on September 15th. You'll be able to register. And what we're going to do is you're going to come and it's going to be a didactic, you know, me talking at you all the time, it's just not the way that, you know, you can get the most out of this. What we'd like to be able to do is these will be smaller groups. You can bring your action plan templates. You can ask questions. You can talk with your colleagues who are part of this group. You can get ideas, suggestions. We want that to be more didactic, and we want you to come with that with a promise that you'll engage and as best you can, and help us understand what your challenges are and how you may think about that differently with input from a larger group than just from myself. And then we'll have part 3 on October 7th, and that one I'm going to be going into the exciting area of workflow and processes. We'll do revenue cycle management, we'll do internal controls, we'll do quality improvement. I learned through experience recently, we put up a BHCC, we had new reporting requirements. It's all about the workflows. If we didn't put the good workflows in place, we were never going to be able to measure our performance, and we were being held accountable to that. The work you do is all about workflows. So we're going to take workflows and talk about them separately. It's not the most exciting conversation in the world, but it is a critical portion of business best practices. Good, efficient, well-monitored, well-structured workflows. So with that, we're going to move on to questions, and I have the chat box here. So let's see if I can.
So David, I just want to interrupt really quick. We just want to let folks know that there's, for the office hours that we're holding on September 17th, people are going to have a choice. And Jocelyn is sharing on the screen right now those office hours. And people will have the opportunity to register for either the 2 to 3 o'clock or the 3 to 4 o'clock. We also wanted to let folks know that there are already save the dates ready for October 22nd and for November 19th. So we just wanted to make sure that people had that information. And then we did have one question that was coming through as you were going over, what our next steps are. And those were related to per diem or per service rendering. And if you could help folks just kind of understand how those employees are handled in the financial modeling.
Per diem, sure. And that's a good question, and that comes up all the time. And because it's a staffing methodology that it's interesting because it goes through cycles. I was seeing a lot of per diem work when APGs first came into place, and then it fell by the wayside, and now it's coming back. I think in financial modeling, you have to carve your per diem out a little bit differently. And one of the ways that you could do that is, in particular if you have a large per diem budget, staffing, is when you build your staffing matrix, instead of having your fringe benefits as a single percentage applied to all staff groups, you could create a fringe benefit number for each staff group. So as an example, that I was showing your peers, they could have your normal staffing normal fringe benefit of 30%, but your per diem could have 0%. So for each of those staff groups, you would add a column for the percentage of fringe. Now, all of the personal service models in the financial modeling is going to have a productivity number. So if you have per diem staff and you have one FTE of a per diem staff, and you're going to get one clinical billing hour for each paid hour, then you could add another column in that and set your productivity by staffing group. And so those are the two fundamental changes that we see with the per diem. We see their cost structure is different and their productivity is different. And if you have a lot of per diem staff, then build out your personal service model in your financial model to differentiate fringe benefit costs by staff group and productivity by staff group. Now, I've created models that do that. We did a residential treatment model where they used a lot of per diem staff. So instead of a single fringe benefit percentage and a single productivity by staff group, we broke that out differentially for the per diem staff. Other questions other than the fact that people couldn't see my screen? I apologize again for that. Let me look. How do you handle employees who work per diem? All right, we did that. Can also come into play when you're using staffing agency to cover certain functions. Yes. So when I had staffing agencies to cover certain functions, it really depends on how that works. They could be treated as an OTPS and other than personal services sometimes. It really depends on how you budget it, what your relationship is, what you're paying for, whether it's a revenue producing. But yes, you can do that. So it is, yes. Looking for reverse perspectives. Cost per service, tricky when some FDI, there's not per diem too, yeah. No. So the question here is, thanks, helpful info. Looking from reverse perspective, i.e. cost per service, tricky when some staff FTEs and others are per diem. Well, cost per service is aggregated across all of your activity. So if I'm understanding the comment correctly, you certainly would have a different cost per service by your employed staff versus your per diem staff. That's really where the cost savings, because if you have enough of those per diem staff at a much lower unit cost, that rolls into your higher unit cost for your regular FTE staff, and that's where you end up driving down some of your unit costs. I never really, at the end of the day, your unit cost is an aggregate. And it's interesting modeling. So, think about modeling out is if you were considering going to per diem staff is, what effect would it have? How many per diem staff would you want to have? What are the problems associated? What are the values? It's a financial value. Maybe they're harder to engage, harder to supervise. I don't know. I didn't do a lot. I've talked with people a lot about per diem staffing, but we didn't have much of a per diem staffing model. So, yeah, you can take a look at that. And somebody asked about zero-based budgeting, and the approach that I took is just, we talk about best practice, but what I've said, there's many ways to approach this, and there's many different budgeting approaches. I think that your approach is not as, in the tools that you use, is not as significant as the process that you implement. Although I showed you a tool that was a tool that worked for me, but a process of engagement, of using data, of understanding variances, of using it as a management tool, of using it as a strategic tool, giving yourself enough time, and use it as the benchmark that you're going to evaluate yourself going forward on a regular basis. Okay, let's see if we have anything else that came in. No, I don't see anything.
No, I think we're good.
All right. So I think I just bought you 3 extra minutes in your life. So I do want to thank you all for coming today. I hope you found this useful. Again, what we're really striving towards is change. You know, take a look at this. Take a look at this with your team. See if there's gaps. If you're not gaps, then great. You're doing it all right, and I applaud you. And but if you're finding holes, is what we want to do. Is we don't want to build the airplane while it's in the air. I know we're in the middle of the pandemic. Things are starting to just maybe ease up a little bit for folks. Make the changes now when you have the time. Make them before the beginning of next year. So if you're not doing budget to actual analysis on a monthly basis, institute it in January. Start the new year with this best practice environment. So take a look at what we talk about. Take what you think is the best of it. Work your teams. Create a plan. Implement change. And strengthen your infrastructure. So thank you again, everybody. It's been a pleasure. I always enjoy speaking with you. Remember, Access teams are going to get information about the office hours. All the information that we had in today will be sent out to you. Post your questions on Teams, and I'm looking forward to office hours when we might be able to get to know you and talk with you. So thank you, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll talk in a couple of weeks. Bye now.